We want to welcome everybody on behalf of Imperial County SELPA and our Senior Director, Dr. Deborah Montoya. We want to welcome you to our second session of this series with Dr. Karina Quezada on topics related to dyslexia and English learners. We want to thank you for your time and for your participation. If you haven't done so already, we ask that you please access the resources for today's presentation in the link that was previously dropped in the chat. We will be dropping it in the chat periodically as more of our participants join us. With that and without further ado, I want to hand it over to our guest speaker, Dr. Karina Quesada. Welcome, Karina.
Good morning, and thank you, Lupita. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here. I appreciate you joining this morning. I know how busy we all are, especially toward this period of the year. Thank you for coming back. If this is your second time joining us, and if you're here for the first time, I welcome you, and I hope that the information that we're going to share with you will be meaningful and useful in your practice. So just to kind of give you some understanding of where we're going today in the next 3 hours that we have together, I am going to go ahead and give ourselves a little bit of a refresher of what we discussed on day one. And that's for all of our benefit, for those of us that perhaps were not in attendance the first time around. And if you missed that first piece, I'm going to take just a few minutes to go over some of the information, the highlights of what we presented on day one. And then we're going to move on and talk about the pre-referral process and talk about evaluations. The first day that we were together, we talked about those children that are at risk, and we were talking about screenings for dyslexia. But today our focus is more about evaluation, and we'll make a distinction about those things because it involves a little bit more work. It involves a deeper dive into understanding the cognitive profile of the student, and then the complexities that come with the fact that we need to sort out issues related to language and then issues related to what could be a disability. So that's my intention today of going over those things with you. So I'm managing two screens, so hopefully that will go smoothly. You have access to the Padlet. We'll visit the Padlet in just a little bit to find out some of the resources that I uploaded there that I hope will be useful to you as well. And if nothing else, I hope it will be a starting point of getting you ready to put together an assessment toolkit specifically for children who are dealing with dyslexia and for those that are also dealing with suspected dyslexia and have an EL status. So we'll get to that in a second. I welcome your questions along the way. I timed this several times. I do believe that we will have sufficient time to address any questions that may come up during the presentation, as well as toward the end, we will have some time. So feel free to post your question. I don't know if we have the capacity to unmute in this call, but if you don't, that's okay. Go ahead and just type it out. And then my friends, Lupita and Christina, will be assisting me with that and just kind of stopping me when we need to. They will also stop me for breaks. So just kind of let me know. I do tend to get carried away a little bit. So we'll probably take a first break around the hour mark or so, just to kind of have a little stretch opportunity and maybe refresh your coffee. So with that, I'm hoping that you're able to see my screen. Yeah, cool. Yes. Okay. I see some head nodding. Thank you. And so you have access to the Padlet. Again, we'll look at that in just a second. This is our agenda for this morning. We'll do a quick review, look at some pre-referral considerations, and then dive a little bit more into the assessment of those EL students that are suspected of having dyslexia. So here's a review of first day. So as a starting point, especially for our friends who are joining us for the first time today, we define what dyslexia is. And we said that dyslexia is this deficit in the phonological component of language that affects decoding, spelling, accuracy, and fluency. And that in turns makes things very um, problematic in the areas of comprehension. And because we are not being successful with the action of reading, our reading experience becomes not a pleasant one and one that we want to avoid. And because we're avoiding reading, our vocabulary suffers, the background knowledge suffers, and then, of course, our comprehension continues to suffer. So it becomes what we said was to be this vicious cycle of continuous lack of vocabulary comprehension due to the lack of reading abilities. We also discussed that we have 3 different types of dyslexia. And we talked about phonological dyslexia. We talked about surface dyslexia, sometimes addressed as visual in some of the research. And then we also talked about the other one, the one that's called deep dyslexia, which is mixed and usually the result of a brain injury. The other 2 tend to be more of an innate kind of dyslexia. In terms of phonological dyslexia, some of the things that we would notice in children who have this particular type is that they have trouble with phonological awareness tasks and applying phonics. This is the hallmark, if you will, of this particular kind of dyslexia. They may also have some receptive language problems. So our speech therapist would notice, that there might be some issues related to that. You'll also notice that they'll have very difficult time attacking words that are nonsense words or pseudo words. And that's because they have a poor sound and symbol awareness. That connection between what sound, what goes with what letter, is not strong enough for them to be able to decipher a word. So as a result of that, many of these kiddos try to apply compensatory strategies to get them through the reading. And they usually try to memorize text. You'll know that our ability to recall information is very limited. We can hold about 7 pieces of information, the average individual can. So being able to recall more than those pieces, it's very difficult. So these children may do okay in kinder, they may do okay perhaps mid-first grade, but after that, they start to break down. The other type of dyslexia that we discussed was surface dyslexia. And these children tend to be the opposite in that they can decode words relatively well, especially in kinder and first grade. However, when text becomes more complex and when fluency and just reading speed, it's a demand for them, and there isn't a whole lot of more contextual cues to rely on, they tend to break down. They also want to make words that are irregular, regular. So for instance, the word right might be read as rig hut because that makes sense to them. The trademark for this particular type of dyslexia is the slow, laborious manner of reading that is very time consuming, and after a while it becomes very distracting for the student and very disappointing, and it becomes a social aspect as well, and they give up. So you'll notice that they do relatively okay with the phonetic piece, but not with those that are irregular words. And then the last type of dyslexia that we discussed last time around was this one that is accompanied by other word reading errors, such as semantic errors, such as reading the word gate as fence, visual errors, house for horse. They also have the variational errors, such as mountain read as mountainous. And just difficulties with words that you may think are simple and they should know, such as the word the, as, or so. We usually refer to this type of dyslexia as acquired because it can be the result of a stroke, the result of a traumatic brain injury, some kind of an insult to the brain. But it's also important to recognize that some children may actually have this kind of trauma to their brain during birth. So if they have a problematic birth, that could be a factor why they may have this particular type of dyslexia. We also discussed last time that dyslexia, like many other disorders, presents in a range, in a continuum. And there may be children that do not necessarily qualify for special education. Some of them may present with some mild traits that with some really solid instruction, they may be okay. And then you have everything in between, and those that are pretty severe that will continue to require services probably and supports and accommodations throughout the rest of their lives. Another important piece of information that we shared last time is that we in the school setting have the authority to discuss dyslexia. IDEA, the Individuals with Disability Education Act, is last revision in 2004. Under the description of specific learning disability, the word dyslexia appears as one of those qualifying conditions. So there is still a lot of misunderstanding out there from practitioners who believe that dyslexia is not something that we should discuss in the school setting, but it is, and the law backs us up in that aspect. Here's California Ed Code, Title 5 of our CCR regulations, specifically address the word dyslexia in the definition of specific learning disability. So this is pertinent not only at the federal level, but also at the state level. So I'm sharing this, again, to hopefully empower you into knowing and understanding that we do treat this in the school setting, that we do diagnose this in the school setting, and that we are more than trained to do that. Perhaps some of you on this call may feel that you need to fine tune some of those pieces, and that's perfectly fine. And that's the purpose of this trainings, and it's the purpose of us continuing to collaborate and learn from each other. But know that this is our arena. It does not belong in the medical setting. It belongs to us. We talked about dyslexia in the English language, the complexity of the English language, and I will be talking a little bit more in detail today about the complexity of the English language. The English language in and of itself is considered a deep, complex syllabic structure language, sometimes addressed in the literature, in the research as an opaque language, because its correspondence to the letter and the sound is not transparent. It's not predictable. It tends to change quite a bit. We have 26 letters, and we do know that we have at least, and there's a lot of controversy on this, but we know that we have at least 46 different representations of how those sounds can be written based on the 26 letters that we have. So that, in and of itself is a complex issue. And then you add to that the component of disability, and then you add to that the component of an English language learning status, and that makes things even more complicated. So as opposed to Spanish, Spanish is considered a transparent language because it's we have 27 letters, but it's pretty consistent. There's only 1 or 2 letters that tend to switch off things a little bit for us. But aside from that, they're very predictable sounds. So what do we know then about dyslexia is that it's a neurological impairment, right? Meaning that you're born with it. We know that the brains are the same across cultures and languages. Whether you're a monolingual or a bilingual, multilingual person, your brain composition and designations of where things are happening are the same, regardless of where you're from and what language you speak. What is not the same are the orthographies, the way we represent our language. That is not the same across languages. So as a result of that, how the condition of dyslexia affects you will be a little different. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means. And I will be focusing more on the Spanish language. And I apologize for those of you that may be dealing with other languages in your area. My focus, I guess, in my study has been primarily in the Spanish language. And I'm sure I'm being biased here because that's my language. That's the one that I speak. So I'll speak about the differences in relationship to Spanish and how the manifestation of dyslexia, it's a little different when you are bilingual or in the process of becoming bilingual. So the difficulties, nonetheless, correspond to the complexity of the language. And most of the Latin-based languages, Romance-based languages, such as Spanish, will have a similar representation of the dyslexia disorder. So, and that's true for Italian, French, Spanish, and many of the other Latin-based languages. So we'll talk a little bit more on that later on, but we do know that the profile of a poor reader in both EL and monolingual English speakers is very similar. They both present with difficulties in the phonological awareness and working memory components. So that helps us in understanding how to assess students when we're determining special education status. So this, of course, will suggest that we have an underlying processing deficit as opposed to just a language minority status, which is something else that we're going to be discussing a little bit more in detail. If you were with us last time we were together, you also heard me speak about a dyslexia screening, which is a completely different factor than what we're going to discuss today in relationship to evaluation. So a screening and an evaluation are completely different things. For purposes of a screening, what we're aiming for here is to determine which children present with at-risk traits of dyslexia. We're not calling them dyslexic. We're simply noting that some of their deficits look similar to dyslexia. And the purpose of a screening is really meant to guide our instruction. So as we are working with children and determining where they stand on these particular areas, we can adjust our instruction for them and design interventions that are appropriate for them. So critical things that we need to include in a screening that we discussed last time were letter naming. Knowing the name of the letters and knowing them with confidence, and noticing whether children are distracted or inattentive will guide, what we believe to be a child who's at risk or not. I also highlighted this section here for you because it's important for you to know that you need to be aware of the instructional content that is going on in the classroom. So what I mean by that, if your student is working in a dual immersion program, or they're being taught exclusively in their primary language, and that happens to be Spanish, knowing the name of the letters in Spanish is not necessary for reading. So as a result, the name of letters may not be taught. So that's something that you need to be aware of based on the instructional context of what is happening at your own school site and what is the curriculum and what is that our teachers are teaching to our students. And then letter sounds, most kinder and first grade students should have a solid understanding of associating the sound with the letter that they see. So that will give you an indication of whether interventions are needed. Rapid naming, we discussed that last time. I will be going into a little bit more detail today, and I'm mentioning some of the tools that we typically use for rapid naming. But rapid naming is the presentation of about a field of 50 items, pictures of things. It can be everyday objects, it can be numbers, it can be letters. And we ask the student to name those as quickly as possible, and we're timing them within 1 minute. How many of those can you get through? And from that, you get a percentage, and you can determine your own group norms out of your own classroom norms and determine those children that are at risk. Rapid naming is highly associated with dyslexia. Children who have the inability to bring forth the name of an object with accuracy and with speed tend to have a very strong correlation with dyslexia. The other component is phonological processing or phonemic awareness. We will talk a little bit more in detail about that today, but phonemic awareness has a range of skills as well. The most basic one is rhyming. And then, of course, it would be blending, segmenting, deleting, substituting sounds within a word. So that's a component that is critical in any kind of screening. And this The three that you see in red are the ones that are highly correlated with dyslexia. So you want to make sure that you're addressing that component. Word reading, this is our presentation of words in isolation. Again, you're looking for automaticity, for effort, for frustration levels. Nonsense words, this is the true way of knowing whether a child knows his or her phonics. Because they're not relying on memory, they're not relying on contextual cues. This is how we truly know whether the child has a solid understanding or not. And then, of course, oral reading, which will require that we listen to children so that we're listening for their errors. So these are some of the things that we discussed last time around. As I wrap up this section, one of the other components that we talked about last week, and we'll talk a little bit more in the next session when we begin to talk about interventions for students that have dyslexia, is understanding the simple view of reading. And what is that? What does that say? What is the appropriate way of teaching children how to read? And we have known this research for many, many decades now. Research that goes back a good 40 years, that we know that reading comprehension, which is what we ultimately want, is the product of language comprehension along with decoding. The decoding is the word recognition. And of course, language comprehension has to do with things related to semantics, to syntax, to pragmatics, and being able to understand the different kinds of discourse that we have, right? Being able to understand a novel, an argumentative text, a position statement, as well as poems and poetry and that sort of thing. The decoding piece includes phonology, orthography, and of course morphology, which is the higher prefixes, suffixes, Latin roots, and that sort of thing. So all of those components, the product of these two components is what equals to reading comprehension. So if in our instruction we are addressing these pieces, this is the what of what we need to be teaching, the likelihood that children with dyslexia and those even without dyslexia will benefit. So this is standard practice, consider standard practice of what is effective reading. And again, this goes back to the work of Goff and Tumner back in 1986, and it's called A Simple View of Reading. And with that, it's the principles of the how. How do you teach this? Well, you teach this in an explicit, systematic, cumulative, diagnostic, and responsive manner, which is what you will hear described as structural literacy. Structural literacy is not a program. It's not something that you go and purchase, but rather is the knowledge that the classroom teacher brings into the classroom in being able to explicitly teach these components of reading, being able to explicitly teach phonemic awareness, decoding skills, and having a system for it. There's a rhyme and a reason for it. It's cumulative. We're building up on each one of those skills. So there's a scope and a sequence to what we're doing. And it's diagnostic, meaning that it's not followed by curriculum that has been prescribed for us, but rather it's determined by the student. We are engaged in formative assessments along the way and responding to the need of the student and adjusting our instruction as we go. So that is the how. And the how is, again, through structural literacy components. In all of this, it is critical that we address oral language. This is often overlooked in some of our classrooms and in some of our way of thinking, but it is so important. That is the component of language comprehension. And for our EL students, this is a critical thing that we want to be very specific and meaningful and purposeful in developing oral language for our kiddos. I've also had the privilege of working with some of our kiddos who are monolingual students who come from a impoverished kind of a setting as a result of a variety of factors. And many of them lack oral language. And that is one of the reasons why their reading comprehension has not taken off yet. So any questions? That was a summary of what we discussed last time around. So that took, just about as long as I thought it was going to take. Any questions on what I just shared? And is there anything in the chat?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, there is. There's one question that just popped in. The question is, how do we identify the severity of dyslexia? Is it in testing or in response to systematic reading instruction progress monitoring data, or both?
I would say both, and especially for your EL students. Very good question. I love that question. And that's one that we're going to be addressing in a little bit, in a little more detail, because and this is where it comes critical. So you have this child, right, that maybe just moved to your district, and you really don't know what kind of instruction they received. Not sure whether they received any primary language instruction or not sure if they attended school. Some of those pieces are not clear to us. The only true way of knowing is to purposefully and very systematically provide them interventions that are geared and tailored to their need. And if they're responding to that instruction and making progress, that's not a disability. So, instructional teaching, purposeful teaching will sometimes help us. In some instances where you have done, these screenings, where you have been tracking students, you're collecting progress as you go, and you're realizing that they're not responding, then I would say, okay, it's time to look for something else. And of course, we'll talk a little bit more about making sure that what we're delivering is appropriate and that is done with fidelity, right? Because that's one of the components where sometimes we may mean well, and on a piece of paper it looks like a good plan, but the actual delivery may or may not be there. I hope that answers that question. I will be touching on this a little bit more as we go. All right.
That's the only question in the chat.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let's move on then. We'll talk a little bit about the pre-referral considerations for EL students. Because I want to make sure that we're all on the same page, right? I'm not always aware of who's in the room and who signed up for this. So I don't want to assume that we all understand the disabilities that exist under IDEA. As just a general, we have 13 disabilities under a child with special needs could qualify. And when it comes to EL students, we know that approximately 1.6% of students that enroll in public schools are duly identified as a student with disability and as an English learner. Okay, so here's a graph for you. These are the latest numbers that I have available as of March of 2022. So that's something there for us to consider. And the percentage of students with disabilities who are ELs in California is about 26%. That is actually a drop from the 2020 to the 2012, which represent about a 15% drop. But here's where I think I'd like us to focus a little bit. This is information from March of 2022, so this year, and the data that they're using is, from 2019-2020 school year. Specific learning disabilities, speech and language impairment, OHI, autism, and intellectual disabilities. The darker graph shows you EL students, and the lighter one, the blue one, shows the non-EL students. So as you can see, we are overrepresenting our EL students in the majority of these categories, with the exception of OHI and autism. But we are overrepresenting in intellectual disability, speech and language, as well as in specific learning disability. Dyslexia, as I mentioned earlier, falls under specific learning disability. And then this is another alarming status for us. The EL status and exit reasons. There are 3 reasons why students exit at special education. They may exit because of dropout, because they graduate with a high school diploma, or they graduate with a certificate of completion, which is not the same as a diploma. The darker color represents EL students. So we are overrepresented in the dropout. We are underrepresented in the diploma attainment. And we are somewhat, relatively close, I guess, to receiving a certificate, but not quite. So this tells us that we have some work to do in a variety of different scenarios here. So when we are considering this phenomenon that it's occurring, we have to talk about a couple of documents that I'm going to be referencing. And one of them is the California English Learner Roadmap. You are probably familiar with that document, which provides us with principles for which to guide our schools, our districts, and our programs. And one of those critical principles is that we must view students who are ELs from an asset-oriented and needs-responsive approach, meaning that the culture and the language that they bring to the table is valued, is recognized, and we build upon that knowledge. We also, under those principles, need to understand that no single EL student presents with the same profile. They're very unique in their needs. And we'll talk about some of those differences that we understand today. There's a lot of diversity in our EL students, and we need to be aware of that and not prescribe the same program for all. Our districts also need to encourage and value strong family and school connections and partnerships. And through the assessment process, that is one opportunity for us to build those strong relationships. And I will be highlighting those pieces for us today as we are engaging in an evaluation. And then the other component of this is that districts must develop a collaborative framework to identify EL students with disabilities using valid assessment practices. And that's some of the things that we're going to be discussing as well. So this document should serve as a guide for what we do. So hopefully you're have that as a foundational piece. Another piece that we need to be aware of is, of course, the California English Development Standards that were adopted in 2012. I'm still surprised that even though it's been 10 years, when I do some of the professional development that I do in our districts, teachers are noticing those standards for the very first time. So, that again, tells us that we have a long way to go, that we still need to bring a lot of awareness. But within those standards, there's a chapter 6, that talks about foundational literacy skills for English learners. And in those foundational literacy skills, we discuss things such as print concepts. So starting with the very simple stuff, building up with phonological awareness, phonics, and fluency, and how those components are critical for students at all levels and at all ages. So this is something that we cannot neglect. ELs face that additional challenging of developing literacy as they are developing their English skills and their English language and vocabulary. So while still learning to read and write. So, it's a dual challenge, a dual hat that they're wearing, and we need to be aware of it and be intentional in our instruction in teaching those components. And then, of course, as a guide of what we are going to be discussing in the next couple of slides is chapter 2 of the California Practitioner's Guide for Educating English Learners. So I want to refer to you also to the wonderful work that our Imperial County SELPA has done. They have taken on the lead on this work, and they have some great resources. I encourage you to check out their website if you haven't done so. There are some great graphics, some information that has been pulled from this document that is pretty thick. I don't know, some 600 pages or so, if I'm not mistaken. And they have helped us dissect what is contained in that document. So I encourage you to look for those resources. And a lot of the work that you're going to hear today and a lot of the recommendations that I'm going to be sharing with you come from this document, which is something that we're going to be discussing. But as a pre-referral process, we have a legal obligation to EL students, and we are required by law to provide them with access to a broad and comprehensive curriculum. That's the number one piece there. We're not watering down the content. We're making it meaningful for them and accessible for them despite their level of proficiency. And we do that by building their English language development in integrated and designated instruction. So briefly, we talked last time about this. There are far more extensive trainings on this from our friends at Imperial SELPA. So I'm not going to spend an extensive amount on this, but I would be not doing justice to our work if I did not mention how critical this component is. It is not ethical or legal, for that matter, for us to be talking about an evaluation for special education when we have not completed and ethically and legally provided what children are entitled to. And that is the components of an ELD program that are strong. So integrated means instruction in which ELD standards are used in conjunction with the academic standards, right? They merge nicely, but we're integrating those and being mindful of them. And then, of course, designated instruction is provided in a time that is set aside. It is protected time of the day where we are grouping students based on their ability of language skills. And we are purposefully delivering their ELD standards in order for them to increase their knowledge of the English language. So this will provide them access to content, which is what we need them to be able to do. Another component of our legal obligations is that we're required to maintain a system of notices, outreach efforts, staff training, and referral processes to identify students who may have a disability. And this is, of course, despite their language proficiency. Our legal, so I discussed the legal, the ethical obligation that, of course, we have is to provide quality instruction that includes the best teaching practices, research-based interventions, and ongoing progress monitoring in order to avoid the over-identification and under-identification of EL students in special education services. So hence the reason why I started with those graphics, right? To highlight to you that we still have an issue with this. So we need to ensure that we're providing good instruction to our students. From an asset point, we need to understand that students are viewed as complex, multifaceted, and that they bring many attributes to the table, including their home language and their cultures. And that can be a vehicle for us to build knowledge as they are developing their English skills as well as their literacy skills. And ELs come with many times with already a rich background. It's a matter of us tapping into that. I also want to make sure that we are on the same page in regards to linguistic segregation. And what is that? That is coupled by lower expectations for ELs and the questioning of whether they're capable of grade level curriculum. And sometimes we see that in our programming. We see that in the access that we provide them to certain classes, or in the access that we provide EL students to intervention courses. This is one of the most common obstacles encountered by ELs. And as a school leader, it's our responsibility to call that out and to do something about it. Designated ELD is a protected short time of the day when ELs are separated from their English-only peers. So aside from that, our students should be integrated and participating fully in all activities and exposed to rich content. I believe I shared with you last time that in a district far, far away, the practice was that EL students were not participants of reading intervention courses. And the view from those folks that were making those decisions was that we only have this many slots available. These children are just learning English. They don't need that. So, those are some of those implicit biases that sometimes we have where we underestimate the potential of students of color, and we expect and are indifferent to lower levels of performance. So we expect them to do poorly because they're learning English, and therefore we're not necessarily going to provide interventions. So as we're coming in and talking about assessments, we need to make sure that we have a good, solid foundation to begin with, and that our children have been exposed to rich instruction. And that includes their participation in multi-tier systems of support, which, it really is that initial focus, right, is on quality teaching for all students, despite their ability, despite their language status. And that would include, of course, a comprehensive ELD for students who are ELs. And it would also include appropriate assessments. That means those screenings, diagnostic, formative, and progress monitoring to inform our decisions. And that we're providing that supplemental and intensive instruction for those that need it. And along the way, in all of this, you're also incorporating universal design for learning, or UDL strategies and principles. UDL in and of itself, right, it's a full day training. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on that, but it is important, I think, for me to mention that. And when we're talking about tier 1 and tier 2 instructions, knowing that that information needs to be driven by data, that we are collecting that data, that we're not just, okay, here's, I'm just going to say it, but as a psychologist, as a school psychologist, one of the things that I would usually get when we were determining the referral and whether it was an appropriate referral or not, there was this data that was collected in September and then nothing done. And then there was another piece of data collected in December. And of course, there wasn't any growth and there wasn't any progress monitoring. And the argument was, see, there isn't any growth. They must have a disability. But that's not how tier 2 and tier 2 interventions need to be provided. We know that we need to have baseline data. We know that we need to provide interventions that are designed for that specific need of the student. We need to provide that in small group instruction that have been grouped purposefully based on the need of the students. And sometimes we might need to move into a one-to-one setting. We also know that we need to have fidelity as we are implementing these strategies, right? It's not just about collecting data on certain points of the year, but rather this ongoing formative assessments that will guide my instruction as a teacher. And all of this is being collected. And if indeed there is no progress, then sure, we want to move forward and determine if there is also a disability occurring. But these components need to be in place. So if we don't have this, we need to be asking ourselves, how do we get ourselves there? Because this is not a student issue. This is a systematic issue. And we need to address those systematic issues. Also know that tier 3 interventions are meant to be short-lived. Here's another area where I think we often make a mistake. We tried interventions forever and ever and ever without actually moving along and realizing that the child is not responding, and therefore we need to do something different. And even perhaps that could be a referral for special education. So tier 3 interventions, as important as they are and as critical as they are meant to be temporary. So we need to be very clear about that. In regards to UDL principle recommendations, from EL perspective, from a linguistic perspective, I think the only piece that I would add to this would be to really get to know your student, to understand their background, their language and what they bring, their likes and dislikes, understand their culture and their linguistic backgrounds and their strengths, and create experiences that tailor that honor that culture, that honor that language. Be flexible in your journey is one thing that we also hear often, right, in UDL kinds of trainings. You want to allow the student the opportunity to have choice and to demonstrate their knowledge in a variety of ways, and building in accessibility features as they are developing skills. And that would be perhaps uses of technology. And I'm talking about applications that would allow us text to speech or speech to text, dictation kinds of things, so that children can demonstrate their knowledge and participate despite the fact that they are still building either vocabulary or literacy skills or both. So integrated and designated, I kind of talked about that as well. Please know that designated is not an intervention, right? This is part of the EL's core curriculum. It's something that needs to be done. It's not a prescriptive class, but rather a protective time each day. The law doesn't say how long it needs to be, but it does need to be something that is consistently done. It's expected. This is not an intervention. And I want to repeat that again. It's not an intervention because many of our children who are receiving reading intervention in a school, our ELs are not participating in that. Instead, they go to the ELD time, which is perfect. It's great. I'm glad that they're receiving their ELD time. But when are they getting their intervention? They also need to have access to that reading intervention. Remember, Chapter 6 of our ELD standards calls for us to be intentional about teaching reading. So we need to provide ELD time, but we also need to provide an intervention appropriate to their needs based on what they need. Culturally and linguistically relevant core instruction, interventions, and supplemental supports, they all need to be tailored to the academic need of the student and their linguistic needs. So that will vary, right, depending on whether the student is an immigrant or maybe a long-term English learner or a newcomer. So those are some of the unique perspectives that you will need to take into consideration from a linguistic perspective and also from a cultural perspective. And then leveraging that knowledge and that need based on what they require. So for you newcomers, some of the academic needs that they have, of course, will be related to cognitive and academic rigor, must be present. So that's something that we need to ensure that that continues to be there. Our focus is on developing disciplinary language and literacy. So we're providing vocabulary words that will provide them access to content, and we're building literacy for them. It will require substantial scaffolding. This is a lot of work, and I recognize that for our teachers who have a multitude of things to do in a classroom, but it does require that substantial scaffolding, which means that you are planning, right? There is very intentional purpose on what you're doing throughout the entire day. Your vocabulary must be, the teaching of vocabulary must be explicit, extensive, systematic, and it needs to be focusing on general academic terms. The reading, initially, you will need to provide a lot of support to that complex text, structuring that so that you can provide equitable discussions. Depending on what it is that you're trying to accomplish, if it's content that you're trying to deliver, if there is the ability for the child to read the text in their own language and that is available to them, that would be one way of doing that. Sometimes we have textbooks that are, there are abridged versions of it that do not have necessarily all the complexity. So that may be a strategy initially that you could utilize. And then in terms of writing, using models, proficient models to provide students that structure. So a lot of those webs and strategies that you will need to use in order to develop the writing sentence frames, and just providing a lot of supports, a lot of scaffolds, so that you can begin to see some writing production from students. Your newcomers might also benefit from that primary language usage to leverage some of their understanding. That, of course, promotes biliteracy and sustains that cultural pride. We know that. In this component, you can also be very purposeful in highlighting cognates. So those are words that are very similar in both languages. And then providing reading foundational skills. And that includes phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and basic comprehension. This is supplemental, okay? And it should not replace grade level text and coursework. So we need to be mindful of that. And of course, oral language. You're modeling that, you're providing some rich oral language usage throughout the day, and also allowing children to practice language. And those exchanges that are intentional and scheduled within your lesson, where children are practicing the language between each other. For our long-term ELs, and as you know, long-term ELs are students who have been in a U.S. school longer than 6 years and have not reclassified. Those children require a greater focus on academic development, grade level complex text, and really disciplinary learning. So that content, language, and vocabulary that is specific to the subject. For many of these children, one of the primary factors holding them back could also be reading, and really understanding what is going on with their reading. Where is the gap? What is causing this gap that is not allowing the child to move along in the area of reading, is one thing that we need to make sure that we highlight in their instruction. In terms of reading skills, our foundational leveraging primary language and literacy skills. So if a child can blend phonemes in their primary language or L1, they can easily transfer this skill to English. When you know how to read, you know how to read. You may not know the vocabulary and may not necessarily understand all that you read, but you'll be able to decode. This also requires that intentional highlighting of cognates and emphasizing those similarities and differences in the primary language and in the target language, and supporting that meta-linguistic awareness to accelerate learning. That means that you as the instructor, as the teacher, are being very intentional about pointing out those similarities and those differences, and that you're helping children internalize that learning. And you are talking out loud and thinking out loud, and letting children understand how you are processing language so that they can learn that from you. In regards to reading skills, I want to also point out that pronunciation differences are not decoding or comprehending difficulties. So again, this is being culturally and linguistically sensitive, right? You'll notice that in us, right? And you'll probably notice that in me as well. I still have an accent. I still have pronunciation differences that are not equal to a native speaker, but it doesn't mean that I don't have the right reading skills. So you want to make sure that we're differentiating those things and that we are truly addressing what the focus is. Focus on the speaking and listening, and encourage developing, decoding and developing. And then teach meaning making to reinforce the importance of comprehension. Again, being very explicit as we're doing read out louds. As we are engaged in our lessons, we're modeling that for our students. And what if an EL has not received formal instruction in Spanish? What then, right? And this can be in other languages as well, but what then? Well, at that point, we need to engage in diagnostic teaching. And this is what I was speaking earlier when that other question came up. We need to be able to present research-based instruction and approaches in a very controlled time that is driven by data, right? So we're having our baseline data. We're providing this intervention for a very structured time. And if the child is responsive, then the child does not have dyslexia. Okay, so that would be one of those critical factors that you're looking for. And as an evaluator for my school psychologist in the room and for my speech pathologist in the room, that's where where we're really drilling things and having those sometimes tough conversations with our teams about what is it that we're truly providing for our students. in this pre-referral stage? Do we have everything that we know they need? Do we have the accurate ELD components in place? Are we providing that with fidelity? Are we just doing that whenever we remember? Or is it a very structured time and we know exactly what their levels are? As a school psychologist, oftentimes I was asked to attend student study teams or SST meetings. And it just blew my mind every single time when I would ask, is this a student who is an EL student? And the teacher would turn around and say, well, I don't know. I don't think so. So those are indications to me that we're not ready to proceed with an evaluation for special education. If we're coming and having meetings and we haven't even looked at the CUME and determined the English status of the student, then I am going to assume that this kind of diagnostic teaching has not occurred for this student. So again, we have a legal and ethical obligation to students, and our obligations are very clearly outlined in the law of what we need to be able to provide our students. So no watered down curriculum, ELD standards, and then very prescriptive curriculum for them.
Karina, can we pause for a couple of questions?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. And I think perhaps after the questions, we can take a bit of a stretch break.
Sounds good.
Okay, so there's two questions. The first question actually circles back to your overview from session 1, just to give everybody some context. The question reads, you mentioned that for learning to read in Spanish, it's not as important to learn letter names as it is to learn letter sounds. How important is it for students who are learning to read in English for them to know letter names?
Yes.
I find that teachers try to teach both letter names and sounds simultaneously to students who are struggling readers.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So there's actually quite a bit of research on this. And I'm going to refer you, and I'm in the middle of reading this book. It's called Reading Above the Fray. The title is supposed to be catchy because, as you know, we have a lot of controversy about how to teach reading, right? So going above the argument, there's a lot of research about how to do this. And just a few nights ago, I was reading that recent research going back to 2018, 2020, 2021, and research that has been replicated, right? So we know that it is reliable, it's peer reviewed. And what they say is that we can teach both of those components at the same time, and that it is far more effective to actually teach those in the same manner. So you're presenting the letter, telling the student the name of the letter and the sound that it makes. And that is actually what is supported in the literature. And then it's not so much that component, but rather which letters to teach first. And you actually want to start with those letters that are consistent with their name. So for instance, the letter M has the sound in its name. So they categorize the names of the letters that are consistent with their names as those that we need to introduce first. And then there are those that have nothing to do with their name, such as the letter H, and it makes a sound, right? Nothing to do with the name. So those, because they tend to cause a little bit more confusion, we want to leave those at the end and build strategies first for the other ones that are more consistent. So, but you do present the name of the letter and the sound simultaneously. And that's actually what is being supported in the literature from what I understand.
If I may add to that in respect to, because the question I think kind of implies that this is a student who perhaps might be in a dual language program.
Okay.
To maximize on primary language, going back to your example of the letter and the symbol for M, in comparison to the letter and the symbol for M in Espanol, it's the same.
Yes.
So when approaching a English learner, whether or not the English learner is in a dual language program, that is a very powerful strategy when teaching literacy skills, particularly decoding phonemic awareness is to maximize what's similar between the two language, particularly in English and Spanish, because the majority of the symbols and the sounds in the English alphabet are similar to the ones in Spanish. There are a few differences, and of course, we know that vowels are fun in English, and you get what you get in Spanish. But I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah.
May I ask the second question, Karina?
Yeah, please. Well, before you do, I
Yes.
like to add a little bit more to that because, you can probably see my smile here. I just love this topic.
Me too.
It turns out also that the other thing that you want to keep in mind as an instructor, as a teacher, is that you want to stay away from teaching at the same time letters that tend to cause confusion um, closely together. So, for instance, the letter D and B. Don't present them on the same day because those two tend to look similarly. And then also the sounds of certain letters are too close together, such as and so leave a little bit of space between them so that there is no confusion. So there's actually a rhyme and a reason as to how we do this. And of course, vowels are consistent, right? Because a says so you want to teach those. So yeah, okay, but I'll stop because I don't want to take more time on that.
That's another session altogether, right? Maybe we can collab on that one, Karina.
Yeah.
The next question goes back to your statement, your section regarding baseline data. And so this question reads, so what can we do in that situation when our schools don't understand and won't collect data, specifically in high school students? I believe it's referring to your scenario of receiving information about a student at the beginning of the school year, nothing happens, and then so that's the context.
Yeah. Excellent question. I love that because that goes down to the very root of our problem, right? And it's difficult. It's difficult to move those conversations along. I am hopeful that you can have an administrator at your side that is open to that conversation. It takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of finesse in having those conversations. And you want to have and build a little village that can support you as to why this is important and get some support behind you. And because we're talking about systematic issues, right? So on an immediate basis, yes, you have a child who's now being referred. Perhaps the parent is now on board. They have signed an assessment plan. There's very little that we can do on that front, perhaps other than move forward with an evaluation. But on the other front, I, as a psychologist, want to make sure that I am at the table having conversations and that I'm at the table having conversations so that I'm not part of the menu. Does that make sense?
No.
If you are not at the table having those conversations, you as a psychologist, you will be the one who's just there to test whoever anybody says you should test, without actually impacting policies, without actually impacting processes. So I would encourage you to start conversations, ally yourself with those individuals with whom have this passion for students, and then start small and start building support for how do we change this. And sometimes that means that we're going to change one grade level at a time. So what is a grade level that could be open to having those conversations and trying out interventions? Bring the support of your administrator, and start having those conversations. That's probably the best advice that I can give in regards to that.
Excellent advice, in my opinion. We have one more question that I would like to begin to address and then hand it off to you. The question reads, when you talk about instruction or intervention that is, quote, geared and tailored to their needs, and their specific reading interventions that are more geared towards English learners as opposed to programs for struggling readers who are not English learners. And basically, this is about what is out there regarding programs specifically designed for English learners for the purposes of interventions. It's absolutely critical that before we start shifting English learners to an intervention time of the day or program, that we ensure that, number one, comprehensive ELD, both designated and integrated, is happening effectively and consistently, because that is a critical component of instruction for ELs. Without it, we are compromising their both language and linguistic development and success.
Absolutely.
So that's first and foremost.
Yes.
Secondly, there are many strategies and varied bodies of research that support strategies within any program or any set curriculum in support of students who are learning English as a second language, not only Spanish speaking students. So that would be another step in tier one. We're only talking tier one, and this is a cross content area. However, there are some programs that are designed and sold, and I want to emphasize the word sold, by publishers that are designed and targeting this population of students. It's important for us to understand the body of research in support of English learners. It's important for us to understand the different resources that are already afforded to us in the forms of standards and evidence-based practices and strategies before we move towards purchasing a program that a publisher says is designed for English learners. That way we can make a sound purchase if we need to. So that's my 2 cents on that question. Karina, do you want to add to that?
Absolutely. I say do not go and reinvent the wheel. Look at what you have now learned from this, right? So we in the last session that we're going to have coming up next month, we're going to talk a little bit more about what is this structural literacy piece, right? What does that look like? And our focus should not be, in my opinion, in purchasing a program. Our focus, I think, should be in equipping our teachers. We know already that the number one factor that can make a huge impact in students' performance is the ability of the teacher to deliver instruction effectively. So if as an instructor, I understand how to teach reading, I understand these components of reading, I know that I have to teach these pieces within morphology, these pieces within phonology, and these pieces within phonics, then I can then turn around and look at what I have and realize, oh, I have this. Oh, I need to go get this other piece because I'm missing this component. So when you are knowledgeable about the aspects of reading, I completely agree with Lupita. You can turn around and look at what you have and realize, I can work with what I have. I just need to tweak it a little bit. So we become smarter than our curriculum, if that makes sense.
Thank you so much, Karina. Lots of information was shared. I would like to be able to offer our participants a little bit of a brain break and let all this information kind of settle down and take a little stretch break. So how does 10 minutes sound, Karina?
That sounds perfect. Let's do that.
Okay. So let's be back at 10:17.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Enjoy your break, folks. And we're back.
Yeah.
Hopefully you all had a nice little stretch break. I know that I appreciate the what I call brain breaks to just let the information settle a little bit. I chatted very briefly with my partner Christina, and we're learning so much, and so we appreciate this time here together. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Dr. Karina because I know that we have lots more to cover.
Yeah, we do. All right. So welcome back. I just dropped in the chat the book that I mentioned earlier, my new acquisition here. It's Reading Above the Fray by Julia Lindsay. I dropped the link to the Amazon if you're interested in it. I don't get a kickback, so just know that if I find something that is useful for me, I'm going to share it with you. But I have no association with this person. But this is the book here. I don't know. Oh. There, Reading Above the Fray. It's program agnostic, meaning that she's not endorsing a program. It's about teaching ourselves how this thing about reading works, so that we can be, like I said, smarter than any curriculum, smarter than any program. All right, so we're going to go ahead and move on then and talk about the assessment of EL students who are suspected of having dyslexia. And as we go along, once again, I'm going to be referring us to what is an appropriate referral, and then making sure that we have all the components that are legally required when we are conducting a psychoeducational evaluation. Just because we're dealing with an EL student or just because we're talking about dyslexia does not mean that we throw away all the other things that we know, right? So we need to be able to incorporate all of those pieces into what we're doing. So of course, an appropriate referral will be, right, that a child's English learner status should never be seen as a barrier to move forward with a referral for special education. So that is something that we need to understand, right? Just because the child is a level 1 EL does not mean that we are not going to consider that child for an evaluation. If all the other pieces fall into place, we move forward with that. Assessing an EL for a disability does not require a waiting period for English language skills to develop. So that is, I think, a common mistake that sometimes we come to the table with. Our legal obligation, I'll remind you again, federal and state law requires that we do what is known as child fine, right? And child fine is that obligation to seek children who we suspect are having a disability. And that includes children who are highly mobile, includes children who are migratory children. So it does not differentiate that. And I'm giving you the ed code for that. Our ethical obligation, of course, is to determine if continuing academic difficulties are truly the result of a disability or not. So that's where the real work is, right? And making that determination. We know from the work of Dr. Ortiz, and I know our Imperial County SELPA folks have had Dr. Ortiz before. You would truly enjoyed his work. He identifies 3 categories of struggling ELs: those receiving inadequate instruction and or lack effective ELD instruction and support, which is what we talked about the first half of our morning here. Those experiencing difficulties because of interrupted schooling, limited formal education, medical problems, low attendance, high mobility, or other external factors. And then those truly who have a disability and need special education services. So as an evaluator, in whatever capacity you work, psych, speech, whatever you do as part of an evaluator, special education teacher, it is our obligation to determine which of these 3 we're dealing with. And that includes, of course, having a well-constructed student study team. And what I mean by that is that we need to have individuals who understand English language development. So those folks sitting at the SSTs or MTSS, however you call it, need to be individuals who understand English language development, who understand characteristics of disabilities, who have primary and English language development principles, right? They understand what that is. And they have cultural and linguistic differences from disabilities. They understand that variety there of a cultural and linguistic differences versus a disability. So what that implies then is that we need to have a well-rounded team that is composed not just of general education folks, but our special education folks and those that understand language differences and language disabilities. So I encourage you to also consider who is sitting in those SST meetings, and do we have the right people there? And how do we inject ourselves into those compositions, group compositions, so that we can influence, right? It's how do we influence the work moving forward? Informed decisions required a couple of things that need to happen. We need to look at a school environment. And again, those are those tough conversations. What are we doing? What are we providing? Do we provide ELD appropriately? What is the current English language acquisition level of the student? Identify the differences between language acquisition delays and other delays. We want to carefully review the CUME file, investigate extrinsic factors, and review previous interventions and data. So I'll break those down in a little bit more detail. This work also comes from the California Practitioner's Guide. There are so many resources in that document. I'm going to ask you to take a look at that. I believe chapter 4 is where most of this information is found. You'll have observation tools, interview tools, how to analyze the environment in the curriculum that the student is receiving. There are some tools that you can use to beef up what you are already doing when you are considering these components. When we're looking at the school environment, we're looking for a explicit teaching of English features and opportunities for practice and application. Is that happening for the student? Is there an emphasis on English language skills? Is there dedicated ELD time? Are we being explicit in teaching our literacy components? Do we have increased opportunities for English language vocabulary development? Is there time for direct instruction? And are elements of UDL being integrated? So as you're analyzing this child's environment, this is what we're looking for. It's not a simple, oh, let me go take a look at the classroom and do a quick observation, 5-10 minutes, I'm out. You know, that's not really what we're looking for here. We're really looking for what is it that the child is receiving, and do they have these components that are critical for them? In terms of their English language acquisition level, do they interact in meaningful ways? How are they using English? Is English in developing their foundational English literacy skills? You know, are we doing that? Where are we with that? You also need to understand that we need to have some general understanding of the progression, right, of language acquisition. Native language, emerging, expanding, bridging, lifelong language learners. Those are all addressed in the ELD standards. Where is that child in relationship to that? Oftentimes, like I said, many times when we're talking about, you know, a referral and whether it's appropriate or not, that's the first time that a teacher is finding out that the student is actually identified as EL. So, you know, that opens up a door for other things. In regards to language differences versus disabilities, this also comes from the work of Dr. Ortiz. We need to understand that all individuals familiar with the student should engage in a reflective process to determine if the skills deficits that we're seeing are actually related to a disability or to maybe English language acquisition. And in order to be able to do that, we need to have a discussion as a team, because one individual may not hold all of that pieces of information, nor do they may hold all of those expertise. So we need to be able to have a conversation with others and say, hey, let's look at this student, you know, what does Roberto look like in the area of reading, in the area of speaking, in social emotional issues, and really analyze the differences that we're noticing and determine if those are more what we would call typical characteristics of a child who's learning a second language, or are they more typical of a child who has a disability? Or perhaps it's both, right? Because that could be the case. So what I like to share and point out to you this morning is a tool that is found in the California Practitioner's Guide, and it's actually on chapter 3, and it's figure 3.3. And it's called a comparison of language differences versus disability tools. And it looks like this. And there's a direct link from our Imperial County SELPA folks where you can access that document. And I'm gonna, oh, I forgot to do that ahead of time.
I just dropped it in the chat.
Thank you, Lupita. Thank you for that. I forgot to do that ahead of time. But the document, you can pull it up, and it has 9 different components. This one that I took a screenshot of happens to be reading comprehension and vocabulary, and it's all organized in 3 columns. The learning behavior that is typically manifested for this specific domain, reading comprehension. And then indicators in the second column, indicators of a language difference due to second language acquisition. And then indicator of possible learning disability. This, I'm encouraging you to have this printed out, to bring it to your next SST meeting or MTSS meeting when you are considering the possibility of referring of a student to special education, because it can be a vehicle, it can be a tool to start some good conversations with the folks who are sitting at the table about what it is that we're noticing from the student. So for instance, student does not understand passage read, although may be able to read with fluency and accuracy, okay? So an indicator that this would be actually a second language acquisition issue is that the student lacks understanding and background knowledge of the topic in L2 or in English, is unable to use contextual cue or clues to assist with meaning. Improvement is seen over time as English proficiency increases. So if you're noticing those things, that there is improvement as the child improves in their vocabulary and in their knowledge of the language, there is improvement. So if you're seeing that, more than likely what you're noticing are second language acquisition issues. As opposed to the last column where student does not remember or comprehend what was read, neither in Spanish nor in English, or in the primary language or in English. This does not improve over time. This may be due to a memory or processing deficit. So, that is, again, a vehicle for conversation. It's a conversation started. So that you can begin to have some meaningful conversations about what it is that we're noticing in the student. And does it fall more with the characteristics of what we would consider a second language acquisition problem, or more of a learning problem? So what I like to do is to give us a few minutes to break into groups. And Lupita, if you can help me with that. I'm sorry I didn't tell you that ahead of time. I should have done that, but I can do it as well if you like me to. We can group folks together, and what I like to be able to do is give you maybe about 5 or 7 minutes to take a look at this document. I don't want to just mention it and then have you forget about it. If you actually pull it up, and if you can look at it and kind of chat a little bit with the group that you're with, I'm hoping that this will allow you to see what is in there, to explore it a little bit, and to be able to maybe refer to it the next time that you're considering an evaluation for a student. So would you, Lupita, would you be kind enough to place us into groups? I think there's about 80 some people is what I noticed. So maybe groups of, I don't know, 5 or 6. All right, welcome back. Oh, look at you. You're all here. You have your cameras on. That's so awesome.
Right.
I get to see some faces. All right. Well, welcome back as you're coming back. I hope you took those few minutes to participate in that, and that you were able to get a gist of what that document looks like. I think is a great tool to use as we are determining the appropriateness of a referral. So I will have us move along. I think most of us are back from what I can tell, right? For the most part, Lupita?
Yes, everyone's back.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so with that then, let's go on and continue and talk about the CUME file. This is not a thing that we want to neglect either. We want to make sure that we are engaging in this process of taking a look, considering the health concerns, attendance, mobility, testing history, ELD instruction that has been received, or maybe primary language instruction that may have taken place. What did the report cards tell us? Is there a history of retention? Has it been special education referrals or evaluations completed before? So all of that, it's valuable information that we don't want to neglect. We mentioned extrinsic factors before, and that would be things such as physical factors, right? That can impact our ability to learn. That has nothing to do with the disability and nothing to do with the language status. But this would be things that can impact, such as healthcare, nutritional needs, even exposures to chemicals, traumatic events, and physical conditions. And then when it comes to personal factors, school moves, economic status, language barriers, family support, unaccompanied minor status, homelessness, foster youth status, all of that plays a factor into how well children adjust to school and how well they're performing. So that will be information that you will be obtaining and considering as you are moving forward with an evaluation. Language factors, are they receiving ELD support? Is explicit oral written language modeled in the classrooms? Are there opportunities for students to interact? Is there explicit feedback on grammar and vocabulary? And you will gather that information from the observations that you're conducting. Are we allowing wait time for children to process language? Are we matching the instructional language level with the classroom demands? And what were the previous and current learning environments that the student has been exposed to? Have they had access to UDL? Was there limited educational opportunities? What is that? You know, we need to be able to define and gather as much information as it is available to us. Sometimes that also means considering what families have to share with us, or even placing a phone call to the previous school. Has there been an intervention tried? What has that looked like? What were some of the curriculum-based measures that were used? Was there formative assessments? Were there language development assessments done? So all of this will help you to begin to identify the strengths and the weaknesses of your student as you're moving along. Chapter 4 of the California Practitioner's Guide begins to talk about the legal obligations that we have in terms of having an appropriate assessment to determine eligibility for special education students. And that includes interviews, observations, involving parents, and making sure that we're using standard measures that are appropriate and sound for the student, and when available, in the primary language of the student when applicable. And that we also have longitudinal data of classroom interventions tried. So this is a requirement in our code of regulations, state regulations. So, you know, that piece about data is not something that we're making up here. It's actually something that is required by law. And of course, our ethical obligation is that we want to prevent a misdiagnosis of a disability. If one does not exist and the skill deficit are just simply the result of language differences only, or perhaps even the result of inadequate classroom instruction. And I understand that those are very difficult conversations to have. I'm not here to speak lightly of that. I know that those are tough conversations, but it is our ethical obligation to ensure that we are not diagnosing a student. So as you know, we have initial steps that we need to be able to follow. We have to review the referral and propose an assessment plan to the families within 15 days. That's a requirement by federal law. We also need to be able to provide a copy of the procedural safeguards to the family and provide an explanation of that assessment plan. So the added component to this, and I know that you know this, right? This is not new if you are an evaluator. But what we need to ensure is that when we are dealing with an EL student, that we are providing the families from the get-go the opportunity to have a say in what is happening with their children and to their children. Remember that our obligation from the California roadmap is that we want to create districts where parents are involved in the process. And we want to present this information to the family in the language that they preferred and be able to explain this to them. So that's something that we need to ensure. And that sometimes involves including interpreters along the way. So you want to make sure that we're following that. Additionally, we have 60 days to complete this evaluation from the time the assessment is signed. And we must not neglect that we're doing a comprehensive evaluation that includes health, vision, hearing, motor abilities, language functioning, general intelligence, academic performance, communicative status, self-help, orientation, mobilities, career and vocational, social, emotional, as well as interests. So some of these components are not applicable to certain populations, and that's okay. But we don't neglect these pieces simply because we're dealing with an EL student. So all of these components need to be incorporated in whatever capacity the student is able to join in. In addition, we know that California Code of Regulations has additional requirements when completing evaluations for students who are ELs. And that additional requirement is that the individuals who are performing this evaluation are competent in both the oral and sign language skills of the student's primary language and understand the cultural and ethnic background of the student. So if this is clearly not feasible, if you simply do not have that staff member who is fluent in that particular language, then we must use an interpreter. Equally, we need to be able to be careful to select instruments that are meant and used for this purpose. And we will identify some of those as we go along here. As you know, required members of an IEP team include the parent and these other folks that are here. I know that this is not new knowledge to you, but I do want to point out that the parent is a team member. They're not just consumers of information, they're participants, they're contributing to this evaluation. And there are very specific ways in which we can engage parents in this process. And having limited English abilities does not negate their right to participate. The other component of this team composition that I want to highlight for you is others who have expertise and knowledge of the child. In the case of an EL student, we might need to incorporate our English language development department experts and having them participate in this discussion and contributions of information and letting us know how the student is doing in regards to language acquisition and what they notice and how they are working with the student. Another important member is a speech and language pathologist. They are critical in language acquisition. So even though we may not be suspecting speech and language impairment, sometimes consulting with our language pathologist can help us in understand the language profile of the student. When we are talking about linguistic and culturally sensitive evaluations, it is critical that we determine which language to use during the assessment that will produce the most reliable information about the student. And then here is where we begin to talk about some critical work, right? That goes back many decades back to the work of Dr. Cummings, right? Understanding BICS, that English interpersonal communication skills, and understanding higher order language skills, CALPS. So we want to have an understanding of communication skills, LPAC data, and formal and informal data that will help us understand the language of the student. Unless we consider this information, we may be attributing low achievement to learning disabilities when in reality we're looking at an academic language proficiency that is not yet developed. So it is critical that you take the time to look at this information. In my current work, part of my job is to review reports that are being challenged in a court. And you'll be surprised how many times these components are not included. And we end up having to pay compensatory services and expensive independent evaluations because simply the evaluating team did not consider that the child was EL and their status was not even mentioned in the reports. The LPAC data was not included. They never consider which language they were going to use in order to assess the student. So we end up losing a lot of cases on very small details that appear small, but they end up driving the whole process. So assessing in the primary language has great benefits. It provides comparative data. It provides the opportunity to see if the errors that the student is committing are similar error patterns in both languages. And it allows us to discern if what we're really looking at here are just academic difficulties due to language differences or to a disability. If the child is able to perform in one language but not in the other one, that is not a disability. So, having that comparative data is very critical. So here's some best practices, right, of how to guide these bilingual assessments. You need to first consider a fully bilingual assessor. Do you have that available? Sometimes that requires that we be creative and looking at my neighboring school and swapping cases with my colleagues so that I can have a fully bilingual person be able to work with my student. And maybe I will take one of their monolingual cases, right, to even things out for us. So we want to make sure that we have that, whenever in as much as possible. I also want to stress, because this has come up a couple of times for us in the due process world that I sometimes deal with, where having a bilingual assessor means an individual who's fully literate, both in the speaking and written form. Sometimes we attribute bilingualism only to a person who can speak the language, but that's not what we're aiming for here. When we have a fully credentialed bilingual person, we're talking about an individual who can hold their own in both languages without any hesitation. So if you're not fully at that level, we want to be ethical and excuse ourselves from that and not claim something that we do not possess. All assessors should assess in the language of preference when possible, right? If that tool is available to us. If primary language assessments are not available, then we want to use nonverbal measures and supplement with other data when appropriate. And I'm also hopeful that one day we will arrive to a place where assessors are trained in this concept of English language development and how we move from one level of language acquisition to another. So that's work that's still in the process for us as we are graduating new school psychologists and speech pathologists who are coming into the field who have this clear understanding of ELD. So what about those children that have not received formal instruction in primary language? Well, there's a couple of things that we need to consider. Students may still be processing cognitively in their primary language. So we need to make that distinction here. Some level of academic assessment can still be conducted, even if it's informally. Consider, for instance, oral language skills. Remember that oral language is one of those academic areas of consideration in our specific learning disability determinations. And it could be that the child is performing at some level in that capacity in their primary language. So we want to be able to make sure that we're capturing that strength in them. If little to no skill in the primary language is present, the evaluating team may proceed with the remainder of the evaluation in English. And Lupita, I see your hand up.
Just wanted to pose a couple of questions that came up before too much time moves on.
Yes.
Is this a good time to?
Yes.
Okay. So there's three questions. The first one you kind of alluded to a little bit. So here it goes. How do professionals, psychs, who are not EL teachers know what a well-constructed EL program looks like? What should a good EL program look like? You kind of alluded to that a little bit, so I'll let you respond to that first.
So So that's where I'm going. Please come back for session 3. In session 3, I actually have 2 videos that I want to share with you because I think it's important. Many times as an evaluating psychologist, speech therapist, special education teacher, we think that that's not our world, that is not our wheel, but it is. We need to be able to recognize what good instruction looks like because our obligation is to go into the classrooms, right, and determine the appropriateness of instruction. And not that we're there in an evaluative role. That's not the point at all. But we need to understand what is working for the student and what is not working. So please come back next time because I have some videos of some great short videos of what good ELD instruction looks like. And I like us to take a look at that because when we're talking about interventions and we're talking about what to do with these children who we believe have dyslexia, well, first we need to be addressing the English component. So I will be talking in a lot more detail about that.
The second question is, what is your opinion on using the PVAT for evaluating a bilingual student?
Dr. Samuel Ortiz, right? What a brain. When I grew up, I want to be like him. So he came up with this assessment that I totally love because now you are comparing yourself, not based on age norms alone, but also based on the fact that you have been in this country and attending school for this many years. And the comparison of my vocabulary is to another child who has been in the country for this many same years. What a clever concept. Who would have thought of that, right? Dr. Ortiz did. So I actually like that assessment. I've done it and I've used it a couple of times, and I love the norming of it. And I think it's a genius way of going about it.
Okay. And third question, do we feel that LPAC data is sufficient to determine language acquisition development? Legally, should we be giving more, such as the WJ language survey?
Mm-hmm. So I would say that I would take each case on its individual merits to answer this question. If I'm talking about a long-term English language learner who's not performing at an LPAC of 3 or 4, I want to dig a little deeper and understand what's going on with this. Is this language? Is this a disability? Why is it that this child has not progressed? The other thought that comes to mind in regards to whether this is sufficient or not is what does the instruction look like? And is the child making adequate progress? So I'm going to say in a blank statement that the LPAC data is critical, but it may not be enough based on the child that we are dealing with.
Absolutely. And I just want to add to the LPAC question that LPAC is a summative assessment of language development progress. So that implies that comprehensive ELD is happening consistently and effectively, and that all the pieces that fall into that instruction, meaning the curriculum is sound, the instruction is sound, and the assessments aligned to comprehensive ELD are sound. Again, back to the ELD standard. So if those pieces aren't in place, then more the reason to take a look at multiple measures to paint a more comprehensive picture of what the student is able to do and pinpoint areas of need.
Yes. I'm going to add one more thing here, and I'm going to check and see how we're doing with time. I know I get a little sidetracked, but here's the other piece about the LPAC. And I know this because I'm out in the field, right? Working with teachers and training them, and even with administrators who do not know about accessibility resources. Another big factor. So if we have, an LPAC that has been administered by sometimes folks that do not work with our students day in, day out. Sometimes we hire paraprofessionals whose job is solely to administer the LPAC. And we send our kiddos over to this room to work with this individual who doesn't know them. so they're not necessarily being provided with the tools, accessibility tools, to really demonstrate their knowledge. So that to me is another factor why I want to look at multi points of data to really determine if what I think is a level 1 is truly a level 1. So,
Very good point. So we have two more brief questions and then
okay.
we'll
All right.
continue. Can you briefly share when you would use the WJ language survey and when you would use the Munoz language assessment?
Yeah. I think to me, those are kind of comparative assessments, and I think it's based more on your preference, um, because you are somewhat getting similar information. So I would say it's a case by case scenario once again.
Okay, there's two more questions, but I think I'm gonna let you give me
Move
the
on.
time to
Okay.
finish
All right.
because I feel like you're gonna address them.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
Sounds good. Okay, so deciding on language of assessment, right? So best practices, once again, if you have a bilingual assessor, swap cases and give that to your bilingual assessor. Make sure that we're being honest in that we have truly fully bilingual folks, literate and bilingual and biliterate. Use an interpreter to administer the primary language assessment. That would be your second best option. Use an interpreter to provide oral translation of assessments, norm and written in English when no primary language tools are feasible. And sometimes we run into that problem. And then the next option would be to use nonverbal measures and supplement with other data. We know that nonverbal measures give us only a narrow view of the child. So nonverbal measures should be considered when assessing children who are still in the process of acquiring English, are experiencing native language loss, or whose linguistic profile indicate that neither one of the languages alone will provide accurate representation of skills. So be exclusive, right, about why you're doing what you're doing. Simply because you're not bilingual, it should not be um, 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 a direct link to using nonverbal measures. There are other stops here that you should consider that I think provide far more information than a nonverbal measure.
Karina, I'm
Uh-huh.
sorry to interrupt, but I have a question specifically to that slide that I
Okay.
want to take advantage of. So what are your thoughts about using the KABC nonverbal versus the MPI with the standardized instructions provided in Spanish?
Mm-hmm. Um, that question to me falls under this other piece here, the third bullet. Use an interpreter, which you're not. I'm going to assume that perhaps you are bilingual yourself and that you're able to provide those instructions in Spanish. So to me, that falls more into the number 3 bullet here. And I would prefer to use that, providing instructions in Spanish before going to the nonverbal piece. My nonverbal piece would be my last resort. So and then I am going to share with you some ways of organizing your assessment tools to help you with this question. So give me a second, I want to get there. So when interpreting test results, consider also within language differences across different skill areas. So for instance, comparing oral language comprehension and expressive language in the same language. And what you're doing here, you're creating a functional profile within the target languages. Another way of interpreting test results that you could consider is to compare functioning in both languages within a target domain. So say, for instance, listening comprehension, compare that in English and Spanish. And that creates that cross-language comparative analysis. And the examiner must then consider any differences between the individual's dominant languages and the language in which the individual receives reading and writing instruction, right? Because that would be the other component here. You want to be very familiar with what the instruction is looking like. And then determine if the characteristics of dyslexia are present across the languages being assessed. Formal tests should always be verified by other sources of data to ensure that you have this ecological validity to what you are doing. So hence the reason why we're looking at data that has been collected through interventions that have been provided, your QM files, all of that is building up to this so that you're not basing your decision on one result only, but rather you're looking at the child comprehensively. In terms of academic assessments, you want to consider the quality and the extent of the formal academic instruction in the primary language. So if the child has received primary language instruction, how long has that been? What grade was last completed in the country of origin? To what extent the primary language instruction was received in the US? Was this a dual immersion program, a transitional bilingual program? Did the child fully participate in all of those years or not? Those are things that you want to take into consideration as you are considering whether the academic assessments need to be provided in Spanish or in the other target language, if that is available to you. So, again, I cannot answer this a black and white kind of yes or no. It would depend on the child and these factors. And how long ago was this? I also need to ensure, right, that we are reminded of how to work effectively with interpreters. Not best practice to just call that individual into your office the morning of and say, hey, by the way, I need you to help me with this. We need to be able to give that individual an opportunity to review the materials, to share with them what it is exactly that we need them to do, the procedures that we want them to follow. And emphasize the importance, right, of following that protocol. I also want to say that we need to ensure that that individual is fully biliterate and bilingual. You'll be surprised, sometimes, once again, in due process cases, I'm attending IEP meetings where an interpreter is brought in and they're stumbling with the written language. And parents become very irritated, and it is a disservice. So that's not what we want. We want to make sure that we have folks that are trained, that have gone through this process, and that we're not just pulling just anybody in to assist us. What we are determining here is very critical, is very delicate, and we want to make sure that our folks have had the training. I'm dropping the name of a training, stands for something, and I'm sorry that I don't have that fresh in my mind right now, but the OLA training is provided for interpreters. It's an agency that has been doing this for quite a while. In my area, we have had them come out and train our paraprofessionals who serve as interpreters so that they can assist us with what that quality of work that we need from them. So I'm hoping that that is useful to you if that's a need in your area. Data, right? Document. Determine what the lack of the student's progress has been. What is the instruction that has been provided? Is it evidence-based? What is the data telling us? And in terms of interviews, that's part of our requirement to complete in any evaluation. Make sure that you're incorporating the parents, that the parents' voice is heard in this. And that includes making sure that we have provided an interpreter or an individual who can fully integrate with the parent and talk with them about their child. So use the child's preferred mode of communication, consider their language dominance and proficiency, and really be mindful about that verbal and nonverbal communication. Second language acquisition and its impact on the expression of feelings. I want to spend a few seconds on this. Nothing is as close and dear to our hearts than our children. So parents need to be provided a forum, a space, an environment where they're comfortable being able to talk about their children. That doesn't happen over the phone most of the time. That doesn't happen sometimes with an interpreter who is not sensitive to cultural differences. And so what I'm saying here is make sure that the team that you're working with has the ability to connect with families and has the capacity and the time to really connect with the family so that you can truly get that meaningful information from the family that you need. Here's just a sample of what parents can contribute to us. They can share with us intervention history, attendance, grades, retention. They can talk to us about the health information. They can talk about the overall primary language development in comparison to their siblings and to other cousins and peers. They can share information about behavioral and social emotional development. And when we're talking about dyslexia, they can also share with us family history related to dyslexia. If you were with me on the first day, you remember that I shared with you that there's a strong genetic component to dyslexia. So we want to be able to capture those things from our families. And when we are talking with individuals who are not necessarily fluent in the school lingo, are not fluent in English, or are reluctant about even coming to school because of their immigration status. Sometimes we need to take those extra steps to ensure that we have created a space that is safe for them, where they can share that information with us. Interviewing teachers and other specialists, don't neglect to do that. And specifically, I want to highlight that we need to be speaking with our ELD specialists so that they can shed light into what the child has been able to do and is able to do. Talking to the little guy is so important, right? Or to the little gal. That reveals their language preference as well. And it also allows us to see how they process language, what their metacognition is. And it gives us an insight into how they view themselves and their ability in the classroom. So it doesn't matter, even if you're using an interpreter, make sure that you have the opportunity to have that time to speak with your student. In terms of observations, once again, that is also something that we are required by law. So this is the time where you're going to be gathering information about the environment, how the student is interacting with their peers and their classroom staff. And then exclusionary factors, right? So remember that a child may not be determined to be eligible if the determinant factor, and notice that I highlighted that, because if that is the primary factor, then we shouldn't be qualifying them because of lack of instruction in reading or math or limited English proficiency. If that is the only factor, then by all means do not qualify. If it's a contributing factor, that's a different story. Okay, a contributing factor we can live with, but if it's the only factor, then we have other bigger conversations to talk about. So how do you deal with that, right? With exclusionary factors due to inappropriate instruction. So teacher perceptions of lack of academic progress. You want to examine the comparison standards. Is the EL student compared to native English speakers? Is the instructor or the teacher aware that it takes an EL 1 to 3 years to develop BICS, that social language, but 5 to 7 years to develop cognitive academic language proficiency? To what extent does the student understand the teacher's instructions for each class? Does the instruction address the student's needs? Is the student taught at his or her level? And does the teacher style work for the student? The pace, the format, the visual and auditory supports, are those there? So again, difficult conversations to have. I'm not making anything light here. I understand that these are difficult conversations to have, but we do have an ethical obligation to students. I want to go ahead and move us on to the critical components of a dyslexia evaluation as I'm looking at the time here. So once again, The purpose of an evaluation is not the same as a screening, right? When we are here, we are now determining eligibility for special education. Intuitively, you'll have school psychologists that are leading this assessment. Although sometimes speech pathologists could be there. So when we are talking about this, we now need to talk about the cognitive and linguistic constructs that contribute to literacy. Phonological awareness, rapid naming, processing speed, orthographic coding, morphological awareness, memory span, and working memory is what we know from the research that has been replicated over and again that are the contributing factors to literacy. You can read the research of Dr. Mathers, Nancy Mathers, the creator and the contributor of the Woodcock-Johnson products that we have been alluding to in our chat. So these are the components that we know we have to be looking into more closely. We want to assess those neuropsychological processes that are highly related to dyslexia. And those are in bold print here for you. Phonological, orthographic, oral language, that means the morphological awareness, rapid naming, verbal memory, and visual spatial working memory. Those are what Dr. Kilpatrick has identified as those that are highly correlated with dyslexia. And here's where I think I want to make a distinction as well, especially for the school psychologists in the room. When we're talking about auditory and visual spatial, those are two broad concepts. And they tend to be often average in those with dyslexia. So what we need to be doing is looking at the narrow abilities. So phonological instead of auditory, orthographic instead of visual spatial. Orthographic is more specific to symbols, to letters and words and symbols that represent words. Visual spatial involves shapes, designs, pictures, objects, and location that are not necessarily contributing factors to reading. So an example of that will be the MVPT. That is visual spatial, not correlated to reading. So what we need to be looking at is more of the orthographic. So I'll break these pieces down in some detail. So phonological processing and Spanish speaking and bilingual students. Phonological processing is the most common deficit in individuals with dyslexia, regardless of the orthographic system. So it doesn't matter if you're learning English, Spanish, or any other language. We do know, and I mentioned this earlier, that Spanish is a transparent language in which many of the words adhere to the simple grapheme phoneme conversion principles, meaning that phonological decoding is easier to master in transparent languages because there's a lot more consistency. So the differences between average and disabled readers can be identified based on an individual's ability to decode nonsense words and low frequency words. So if you are in a school where dual immersion program or fully bilingual programs are taking place, providing students with low frequency words and pseudo words is where you want to be. Because words in Spanish tend to be more predictable. So you won't be able to capture necessarily their conflicts with phonological processing. Auditory processing is this big umbrella, and under that big umbrella is phonological awareness and phonemic awareness. So understanding that, I think, helps us organize our assessment tools. Phonological processing has an order of difficulty, and this is the work of Dr. Kilpatrick. Rhyming is the most basic one. Most 2- and 3-year-olds master that at that age. Segmenting, blending, deleting, and replacing are the more difficult tasks. So our tools need to be capturing these components. When you're looking at this, I'm hoping that you're thinking of the C-top, the taps, the Woodcock-Johnson cognitive abilities. The KTEA2 has a component of that. The Pfeiffer assessment of reading has components that capture the phonological pieces that I just mentioned. There's also an assessment called the PIPA, the Pre-Reading Inventory of Phonological Awareness, and the Auditory Skills Assessment, or the ASA, or the ASA. So those are some of the tools that I'm suggesting that you can take a look at. See what you have first before you go and purchase anything, right? We want to work with what we have and be able to restructure our tools based on what we now know about dyslexia. There are also curriculum-based measures that you can utilize. The DIVLS 8 has that. The AIMS has it. The PALS and the Linda Mood phoneme sequencing also has that. So again, you can customize this however is more appropriate based on the team that you're working with. The other component is rapid naming. Now, what does that look like in bilingual students? Dyslexic children of transparent orthographic systems. Remember, those are all the Latin root kinds of languages, right? French, Spanish, and I can't think of any others right now, but there are many of them. You do your homework. Have problems in developing orthographic representations of words. So orthographic processing is really one's memory for letter and or symbol sequence. And that leads directly to accurate and fluent reading. The lack of orthographic processing impacts reading fluency. Challenges faced by readers of transparent languages are most noticeable when reading speed is measured. And the main problem is slow, laborious decoding of words, particularly when the demands become increasingly harder. So this is what you need to understand about rapid naming in your bilingual students that you are assessing. You can read the research from these folks down below. Rapid naming, my psychologists know this very well, is the ability to rapidly name familiar objects or symbols, and is a strong predictor for later reading difficulties. So we use the CTOP for that. The KTEA also has a tool incorporated. The Woodcock-Johnson test of achievement has that. Of cognitive abilities has that. There's also something that's called the Dyslexia Early Screening Test, and the Rapid Atomized Naming and Rapid Alternating Stimulus Test also has that. There are ways of measuring this informally. You can create your own, really, if you follow the same principles of the marketed ones, but using colors, objects, and letters. So this is an easy way of assessing that. But if you have the CTOP, which most of us do, I think you're covered in regards to that. Processing speed is another factor. So it measures the speed of input and perception, right? We know this. Is the speed of output. Automaticity and reading rate are directly linked to processing speed. So you want to make sure that you're incorporating this. When all mental energy is employed on decoding, resources are depleted for other cognitive tasks, such as comprehension. So what happens with those that have dyslexia? What's going on with processing speed and dyslexia? Well, process symbolic information slowly. They process information slowly. Visual processing speed and auditory processing speed. We actually know from research that there's an altered white matter in the temporal parietal region. And this is evident in infancy. So the actual physical view of the brain is different in those that have dyslexia. We also know that females process letter and numbers faster than males. So that's why maybe that one of the reasons why we talk so much, I don't know. Here's tools, common tools. Most assessments, comprehensive cognitive assessments have a processing speed incorporated into them. So you shouldn't have any problems finding assessment tools for that. You know that the DAS has that, the WISC, and the Woodcock-Johnson They can be easily created by using principles as well, if you have other ways of doing that. Okay, let's get to orthographic coding. And this orthographic processing in bilingual students, I want to make that differentiation as well. So delays in orthographic knowledge in children being taught under transparent languages can be observed in the initial spelling stages, that initial letter sound correspondence. It's also evident in spelling nonsense words when compared to real words. And is also evidence in tasks that involve more complex conventions, especially when we're writing. So these spelling deficits are phonological in nature, though. Don't confuse that, right? Spelling errors. Sometimes, I've heard people say that at an IEP meeting. Oh, spelling is not something, they'll figure that out themselves. We have spell checkers. Okay, yeah, we do, but spelling deficits could be the indication of phonological deficits. And that's why we cannot afford to neglect that in our evaluations. So these challenges persist despite the transparent nature of the Spanish language. So you can substitute Spanish for other transparent languages that exist. So this is evident in both languages. And I talked a little bit last time about this word recognition and how it's a two-step dance. You have the phonological piece, the sound of the word. And then you have the orthographic component, the visual component of the language. But the awareness of those two is what we're aiming for here when we're talking about orthographic coding. Do I, as a student who does not have dyslexia, am I able to connect the letter and the sound efficiently and rapidly? And if I have those two pieces together, then I can read. But when there is a disconnect between those two, then I'm looking at problems. We know that English represents challenges for students as it lacks transparency, right? There is no direct link most of the time between the phoneme and the grapheme. The sound does not always correspond with the way it looks, the letter. So orthographic codings then occurs at various levels, at the individual level, at the letter pattern, and then more complex is the morpheme level, right? So the key factor is in the accurate and quick recognition of this irregular or exception words. So for instance, what I mean by that is that we need to be able as a reader to recognize these pieces incorporated into a word, such as extra, miss, para, pre, retro, super. And when I am a fluent reader, I can pick up those pieces quickly, efficiently, in a fraction of a second without having to decode those components. They have been committed to memory, and I can quickly access those. So that's where the phonological and morphological awareness piece comes into play. So what you'll notice with children that have orthographic awareness deficits is that they have trouble forming letters, the symbols. They confuse similar symbols. They have trouble even copying tasks. They have reversals and transpositions of letters. They remember words more slowly or not at all. And they have difficulty with irregular words. And of course, the speed and the accuracy is lacking for them. They tend to omit word endings. They invent spelling. And then you'll also notice that they have problems with math facts, difficulty sequencing, difficulty with multi-step kinds of problems. So all of these components play into it. So an assessment for orthographic processing that I can recommend to you is the FAR. Many of the visual processing measures that we use do not assess orthographic processing because they are only representing shapes and designs. And I'm talking about the MBPT. So that is not what we're aiming for. We're aiming for tools that can measure the letters and words in construct. So the FAR is one that I have found to be beneficial, and it has a phonological index, but it also has a fluency index that is the orthographic factor of it. And it's measuring those components that I was just talking about, those morphological pieces of language. So I would encourage you to take a look at the FAR as one of your additional components that you can add to your assessment when you're specifically considering dyslexia. Spelling, especially phonetically irregular words, letter pattern matching, word reading fluency, especially phonetically irregular words. The KTEA also has an orthographic processing, and there's also the test of orthographic competence, or TOC. That's another assessment that is available commercially for this specific component of orthographic processing. Memory, we're looking specifically for memory span and working memory when we're talking about dyslexia. Children with dyslexia have lower memory spans. They articulate words more slowly. They have poor association between the verbal and the visual. And they usually have comorbid general working memory deficits. So you want to make sure that you're looking at those areas closely in your evaluations. Working memory is found without any problems in many of the assessments that we're currently using. You have the RAML, the WISC, the TONL, and of course the Woodcock-Johnson cognitive has components of that. So you should have no problems addressing those pieces. So in conclusion, as I get to the end of our presentation, and I do have time for questions here. As we are talking about the pre-referral and referral process, it's not just about what tools to use, right? It's also about all the other pieces that go into it. Was there appropriate instruction? Is there appropriate programming? Have interventions been tried? Do we have the data to support all of that? Are the folks that are making decisions about RTI services bilingual, or if not bilingual, do they understand bilingualism? Do they understand second language acquisition? So we need to be looking at the composition of our teams that are making decisions and moving children along the process towards special education evaluation. We need to have very strong consultation teams who understand the difference between learning disabilities and language differences, and really begin to adopt best practices, right? When we're talking about testing, that means that we are relinquishing those evaluations to folks that are trained and are fully bilingual and biliterate, and that we are also asking for help with interpretation, and that interpretation begins from the moment that we're talking with the families, the moment we're interviewing, the moment we're presenting them with an assessment plan. Our evaluation begins at that stage, and we want to make sure that we're incorporating families along the way. So with that, I think that is all that I needed to share with you. You have my contact information here. And I'm going to stop sharing and hopefully see your beautiful faces and bring you here for those of you that have your cameras on.
Thank you, Karina. We do have a couple of questions that I would like to ask on behalf of our participants. And the first one is, how are you feeling about the norms for the DAS-2 getting too old?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that we have other tools that we can certainly use. We have options in regards to what that specific tool measures. So, you know, the fact that you're posing the question also lets me to believe that you're not quite comfortable with it anymore. So it might be time to move along. And I think we have quite a few options. I certainly would want to consider other things. I when I think about the DAS, I think of the CAS. And in my opinion and in my personal preference, I prefer the CAS over the DAS. But that's just me. I know we all have our own little niche, right? We've all developed our own little preferences and our own little tools. Um, I prefer the CAS, and I think that one it's far more updated. And I also think that I feel, when you think about the DAS and the CAS, their um, foundational theoretical approach is very similar. So if the norming is getting too old, I would switch off to the CAS, and I don't think that you would miss a whole lot there.
A follow-up question to that is, are you referring to the Spanish CAS?
Either or.
Okay. And the second question is asking for some examples. Can you please provide 2 case samples, starting from the pre-referral process to SPED assessment, one which qualified under SLD and another DNQ due to language difference issues? Thank you.
So those samples, I think I want to hear that question again. I want to
Sure.
make sure that.
Sure. Can you please provide 2 case samples, starting from the pre-referral process to SPED assessment, one which qualified under SLD and the other DNQ due to language difference issues?
Mm. Well, I don't have that with me right now, so I wouldn't be able to provide that to you. I'm wondering if you're thinking about what are you thinking about the tools or the results or what that would look like? That would be so unique. I don't know that I could come up with that, to be honest with you. But it is a good um, food for thought there. I wonder if Christina and I could collaborate on that at some point. That would be a really good project. I personally don't have that available, but it is an intriguing and one that I would want to maybe consider later on. Lupita, I don't know if we have any more questions, but I do want to take some time to share the Padlet. There are a couple of components there that I want to make sure that people know that exist. Is it okay if I move us into that, since I timed it so that I could have a little bit of time to be able to do that? Would that be okay?
Go right ahead.
All right, thank you. So let me go to the Padlet because I want to highlight a couple of things that I dropped in there. The Padlet contains some training opportunities that you can look at your leisure. There's also dyslexia in the news and this controversy about what reading approach is more effective. So you can read that at your leisure. There's a report writing tools section where I provided you a report sample of what that could sound like and look like when you're organizing your report. There's also by Dr. Mathers, as you know, the collaborator of the Woodcock Johnson. She has created a general dyslexia profile that I think is priceless, that I would encourage you to take a look at that. It breaks down all the different constructs so that I'm going to bring it up so that you can see it. So she has the definition of dyslexia up here. You can add your own dyslexia education code, which will be our SLD code. And then you begin to address the primary reading and spelling difficulties, secondary reading difficulties, whether they're there or not. And then you begin to talk about the cognitive and linguistic abilities. And we talked about these things in detail about phonological awareness, orthographic awareness, memory, rapid naming, processing speed. And then the ability to learn when reading is not required. So that would be, general intelligence, reasoning, right? Your GF constructs, right? If you're familiar and you talk the CHC language, oral language, mathematics, and knowledge, just general knowledge, academic knowledge. And then some of the at-risk indicators, family history, early speech language issues. And then she provides you a template where you can begin to drop your data here for all the different primary reading and spelling difficulties. And you can organize them by average, low average, average, high average, secondary factors, and then the cognitive and linguistic abilities, phonological awareness, orthographic awareness, memory, rapid naming, processing speed, intelligence, reasoning, oral language, mathematics, knowledge, all of that helps you organize your data so that you can arrive at a conclusion as to whether what you're looking at is indeed dyslexia or not. So I love that tool. There's also a list of various assessments that measure different constructs that I wanted to also share with you. This is kind of a universal tools. These are placement tests, progress monitoring, specifics, individual assessment kinds of things. Some were mentioned in the PowerPoint, others were not. So please take a look at those. Some of them are for our speech pathologists. Others are for academic achievements, so our special education teachers, and others are for our school psychologists. There's an informational sheet about the FAR. I know that that is a relatively new assessment. It has been out, I want to say maybe like 4 years or so. So you may or may not be familiar with that one. This one is an informational sheet. What I wanted to share with you is, well, I wanted to share all of it, but I'll come back to this pieces. I also have the Department of Education Resources, the California Dyslexia Guidelines, a Dear Colleague letter that talks about our responsibility to evaluate students despite the fact that they're receiving RTI interventions. RTI is not a reason to delay assessment. There's also some documents for my speech pathologists on the call that have to do with your approach to dyslexia and how you can support the team. Some common accommodations that you can recommend for children who are dealing with dyslexia, some assistive technology, some screeners, informational items. Oh, here's this one. Do vision problems cause dyslexia? Oftentimes, you'll have an attorney, an advocate, or even a parent who's requesting vision therapy to correct dyslexia. There's a position statement from the American Ophthalmology Association that dismantles the idea that vision therapy can cure dyslexia. So I'm sharing that with you as well. And just a few other screeners, instructional resources, websites, books that you can access, and some more articles. But I want to come back here and point out the Woodcock-Johnson products have put together a dyslexia profile, Spanish-speaking and bilingual population assessment kinds of tools. Assessment plan. So don't think about an assessment plan the way you and I know it, but rather about how to organize your assessment. So let me share that with you. It has some initial information about what dyslexia is and how it looks different in the Spanish-speaking population. And then it begins to recommend, of course, their products, right? So this is just an idea. If you happen to be a lover of the Woodcock-Johnson products, this will come in handy for you, and you might appreciate this. But it gives you some Spanish assessments that you can utilize to get comprehensive measures and selective measures as well. So it goes into the bateria, and it talks about the cognitive abilities, general cognitive abilities by using the bateria if you're doing a fully bilingual or fully Spanish assessment. And it breaks it down for you what that measures. And it talks about, and remember that Dr. Mathers is one of the collaborators of the Woodcock Johnson products. So she has a very strong background in dyslexia, and the way the material is organized has her influence and her work in all of this. So it is already organized in a way that you can recognize the individual traits that are characteristic of dyslexia. But I want to get to, and they also have pruebas de aprovechamiento, so that would be the batería achievement. Let me get to the page that I want to point out. It also has the Spanish bilingual version of the test of auditory processing, or the TAPS 3 SBEE. So that's another tool that you can use. The test of phonological awareness in Spanish is another one, and it breaks it down for you what you're measuring. And then, of course, the Woodcock-Munoz language to determine the CALPS and the BCALPS. So, you know, this would be an important piece that you want to make sure that you're utilizing. Okay. And other selective measures would be the P-TONY, if you're talking about the young population, right, for preschoolers, 3 years and up, or 3 years to 9, I believe it is, or the TONY, if you're talking about children that are 6 and all the way to adulthood. So that's what you find here. But then on the profile, which was the first document there, it will allow you to organize your material in this format, similar to the other document that I share with you. So you have letter sound association, basic reading, reading fluency, reading rate, prosody, spelling, phoneme grapheme knowledge, and it is suggesting the tools that you can use to gather that data and the specific test or clusters that you can use, and then you're plugging in your information here. And then it goes on to reading comprehension and written expression. And then you're looking at auditory processing, suggesting these components, depending on what it is that you're using. The orthographic awareness, so that would be the batería achievement and cognitive, and the Woodcock-Munoz. Memory, rapid naming, processing speed, general intelligence, reasoning, oral language. And you can also have the brief intelligence composite there. So there, and then now you come to the summary section, and you can begin to kind of like your specific learning disability determination sheet on your IEP documents. You can organize this and begin to understand the profile of the student, what is being impacted, what are the secondary factors of reading that are being impacted, and what is the contributing factor. Is it phonological? Is it orthographic? Is it memory related? Is it rapid naming? And that will allow you to really write a report that is really meant to identify not only does the child have dyslexia, but even what type of dyslexia does the child have, because that will trigger, and it should trigger, the interventions that we're going to utilize moving forward. And of course, you have the other ability to learn when reading is not required. So what does that look like? Risk factors. And you can have a summary here. So I'm hoping that you can take a look at these documents later on and see if it's something that you could benefit from. There is a early childhood dyslexia profile that's for your preschoolers. The profile for a Spanish speaking or bilingual population, and then the profile for children who are 7 and up. So that could be your monolingual students who are also presenting with dyslexia. And if you click on those, it will give you what that could look like, what tools you could use. You'll see instead of the TAPS in Spanish, you'll see that the CTOP is being suggested there. So that's what it's found in this Padlet. I'm hoping that you can find some benefit in all of this. The report sample is very genetic. It's meant to be a starting point for you. It may not suit your style. Take what you need, discard what you don't like, what you don't need, and then go from there. Build your own. What is it? What makes sense to you? This is one that I put together. It's not the only one, but it's certainly one that you can utilize as you begin to build your own capacity in this. And it's broken down in the components that I have taught you in the last 2 times: phonological awareness, phonetic coding, rapid naming, memory, different kinds of memory, and all of those pieces. Questions on what I just shared, and I'll stop sharing right now.
No questions in the chat just yet, except for if you could please share your contact info slide once more.
Okay.
And the inquiry regarding the slide deck for session 1, if you could please share that again.
Okay. I dropped that. Let me pull that up again.
Right. I do see the Padlet, Dr. Quezada, for session 1. However, the slide deck is not within the Padlet.
Okay. Then I need to make a note of myself to
Yes.
do that, to add that there.
Thank
Okay,
you.
we'll do.
Thank you.
Right. So slide deck for number 1.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Got it. I will do that. Any other questions, concerns as we are wrapping up here?
I don't see anything in the chat, but I think at this point, Dr. Quezada, if this is the conclusion of your presentation, I can stop the recording and open up for the last few minutes.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So I will stop recording, folks, and feel free to unmute and pose some questions after the fact.